Hi, I'm Danny Bent, one of the co-founders of One Run Global Relay. And I wanted to tell you about where One Runner started from and the big lesson I learned that a tiny little idea can turn into something huge, something ginormous that can affect the lives of thousands of people. Back on April the 15th, 2013, I'd just been for a run myself. I was in my running gear, I was drinking a cup of tea in my kitchen, I was listening to the radio, and then suddenly what I was hearing, I'd been listening to tunes on the radio, and then suddenly those tunes changed. The tone of the speaking on the radio changed, and I started to hear about 2 bombs going off at the Boston Marathon finish line. The Boston Marathon is one of the biggest races in the world. It's really, really hard to get into, and people have to work really hard to get there. And what I was hearing on the radio was that 4 people had been killed and that tens of people had lost their limbs. They'd had their legs blown to pieces by these bombs. And as I'm sitting there, I just felt this feeling in my heart that I had to do something to help those people. And I came up with this wild idea to ask the American people to carry a baton that we would shape as a peace lily from the west coast of America in LA, Los Angeles, all the way across America to the East Coast in Boston, 3,300 miles. If anyone's ever done a park run, it is 1,000 times further than that. And I don't really know where to start in the organisation of it. I'm the least organised person you will ever meet. I would do things like, I love running, I would turn up to races, and sometimes I'd forget my shoes, my trainers to run in. Another time, I brought one of my shoes and one of my mum's shoes. It didn't really bode well for the event, but I had this tiny idea in my head, and I was going to work at it and see what came of it in the end. This tiny little dream in my head. And I broke up that 3,300 miles into 10-mile segments. And I was going to ask those American people to run 10 miles past our baton, and then someone else would run 10 miles past the baton, someone else would run 10 miles, until we'd gone from LA to Boston. And we put it out onto a website, shared it on social media, and slowly people started signing up to these sections. And I had this overwhelming feeling that something magical was happening. We got 10 people sign up, and they all wrote to me and said, "Danny, how can I help?" And I just wrote back, "Find more runners." They found more runners. Suddenly we got 100 runners. Exactly the same. They wrote to me and said, "How can we help?" Suddenly we got 1,000 runners, and it was still growing. And we set off with our baton from LA, and the American people carried it without stopping once, all the way to Boston. And in my kitchen, when that tiny idea came into my brain, really it was about supporting, showing some caring to the American people. It wasn't about trying to raise any money or anything like that, but we thought we might try and raise a few pounds along the way. And what actually happened is that we had thousands and thousands of runners take part, and by the time we arrived in Boston, we'd raised over $500,000 for the people affected by the bombing. And if I'd had that tiny idea in my brain and I hadn't done anything, I thought, oh no, that is way too big, way too hard. How on earth can someone with my organisation make that happen? What would have happened? Nothing. Nothing at all. But because I was brave and I decided to take this idea and go for it and put my energy into it and passion into it, it turned into $500,000 for for charity, for the people affected by the bombings. And I just want to really quickly tell you about two people who were involved in the marathon. One person involved in the marathon, one person who was involved in the blast. Nicole was a lady who'd been running the marathon. She had been stopped at 23 miles. A marathon is 26 miles, so she still had 3 miles to go. But she was stopped by the police and said the marathon's been cancelled, there's been an incident, and they just made them sit down and wait. The second person I want to talk about is John Odom. John Odom had been at the finish line. He'd been cheering wildly as people crossed the finish line, but suddenly he was involved in the blast. He was there to cheer his beloved daughter on her first marathon, but suddenly he found himself lying on the floor and his legs had been blown to pieces. And Nicole was John's daughter, and John was Nicole's father. And Nicole wrote to us and said, I'd like to, the finish line holds these negative memories for me and I'd like to change them into positive ones. And so for the last 3 miles of our run, she picked up the baton and with 1,000 people behind her, she ran to the finish line of the Boston Marathon, which was the finish line of our coast-to-coast relay. And she carried the baton with all these people behind her, completing the marathon that she'd set out to do all those weeks ago. And at the end, John Odom, in a wheelchair, with his legs all bandaged up, wheeled himself out into the street and took the baton from his beloved daughter, Nicole. She passed him the baton and he wheeled himself across the finish line, holding the baton. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. It symbolized the end of Nicole's finishing her marathon. It was the end of our cross-country 3,300 mile relay. And for Nicole and John, it replaced those bad memories of the finish line with more positive ones. And the money raised was brilliant. Obviously, $500,000. But for people like John who were involved in the blast, the fact that we did something meant so much more to him. And the fact that all these people got involved, it meant so much more. And for the people involved, the passing of the baton from one person to another every 10 miles just symbolized the coming together of humanity. And I just realized at that point that if we all come together, whether that is all of humanity, like we're trying to do with One Run Global Relay, someone from every single country in the world, or whether it's your classroom with each of you coming together on a project. If we work together, we are so much more powerful than we are as individuals. And that's a really good thing to just keep in your mind as you progress through life, through school, when you're part of a club in sports, or whether when you're at work 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what we can achieve if we come together. And don't forget, if you have a tiny idea in your mind, that tiny idea can become something so big that it changes the lives of humans all over the planet.